Welcome to today's geography lesson from Chicago to London. This is the guy you probably really came to see. My name, on the other hand, is Yitzchok. Willroth. I am the engineering practice manager at a mid-level startup in New York City called Learning, where I get to spend a lot of time doing exactly what I'm going to do today, talking about testing and code quality. You can find me pretty much anywhere important on the internet as Code Rabbi. This talk has kind of evolved over the year and a half or so that I've been thinking about it. It has been a 2-hour facilitated discussion of a couple of user groups, which were very, very well received. I had a lot of fun with it. We're going to try to give you most of that same content here in 45 minutes, so I'm going to be going really, really fast. I'll be around for the rest of the conference. If you have any questions, pull me aside and we'll chat. With all apologies to Facebook, though, there's a couple of sections we might not do, so we're going to go fast and skip. It originally was called a conceptual map for unit testing. And the more I got into the subject matter, I realized that that wasn't exactly accurate. It's really more a conceptual map for test-driven development. And that's really one of the things that we want to do today is dispel the myth that they're the same thing, that they facilitate the same things, and that they fill the same role in the development process. They are completely different things and should do different things for you. We'll start out with some front matter. Basically, pro tip to all aspiring conference speakers. This is where you dumb down expectations. But if you call it front matter, people accept that. Really what I'm looking to accomplish here is just food for thought. These are things that I think are, as an industry, as a community, we are undereducated about to our great disadvantage. And what I'm looking is just to stimulate your thinking on these things. You will leave probably, especially because we're going to be covering a lot of content, more questions than answers. But if I get you thinking, then mission accomplished. That's what I want, is that you should leave here and say, hey, I thought I understood that. I see that there's a little bit more to that. I need to go spend some time with this X or Y resource that Yitzchok pointed me to. Show of hands, 2 unit tests. Okay, all right. The rest of us can still be friends. Those who had their hands up, do you TDD?
Sometimes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Fast.
but there's so many flavors of TDD.
We're going to talk about that. That's exactly what we're going to talk about in the end. What's a primary value unit test? Some of the unit tests that doesn't necessarily TDD. Primary value.
Forces you to write non-complicated.
Good. Simplicity.
Prevents me from making the same mistakes is one of the most valuable things for me.
Yep. Regression proof. Anybody else? Okay. We're moving fast. So usually what I hear is that by having unit tests, I can evidence correctness, I can prevent regressions, I can refactor with confidence. This was a better answer than what I usually get. These are usually the 3 that I get. What, on the other hand, is the primary value of TDD? I'm not going to ask you that, I'm going to tell you that. I have the contention that the primary value of test-driven development is in its positive impact on software design. Yeah? Software design. It's not about evidencing correctness. It's not about going home at night and being able to sleep, that you're not going to get cold in the middle of the night. Hey, what's going on at the office? That that production rollout at 4:45 just didn't work as well as you thought it did. My second contention is that our lack of conceptual understanding has, as an industry, impeded our adoption and the quality of test-driven development that is being practiced. And even look at who I would call the father of test-driven development, Kent Beck. He talks about his creation story, his creation mythology when it comes to test-driven development is a lot of anxiety. He just wanted to know that when he deployed code, it was the right code, and that's to me not the biggest benefit of test-driven development. Test-driven development is about well-designed software. I will be candid. As I've been working with this talk and with this subject matter for the last couple of years, I had kind of a change of heart. I originally that contention I would make more stronger, and I would tell you that test-driven development drives better designed software, and that it was a methodology. That really it should be called test-driven design. I don't go quite that far anymore. I think test-driven development is appropriate, and it's really a workflow that lends itself more easily for you to create well-designed software. When we get to the very end, the geography lesson, Chicago and London, and the 2 schools of thought on test-driven development, we'll see that one lends itself a little bit more to that understanding, that you need to bring a lot of design chops with you if you're going to follow that school's methodology than you would with the others. A little bit of change right there I thought I'd share with you all. Our agenda, again, we're going to go fast. We're talking about how big is a unit. Aren't they all mocks is a section that I probably will skip, but I'll leave it in the slides. You'll forgive me when I click through them very, very fast. They are code heavy, and I want them in the slides, for you guys after the fact. I think they're informative, but we're going to skip aren't they all mocks. And finally, second to last, where does geography come in? That's really the meat of the conversation, the Chicago and London Schools of Test-Driven Development. And finally, we'll have a little fun at David Heinemeier Hansen's expense, and I will answer his question from last year, is TDD dead? So, how big is a unit? Usually that is the basis of a really fun discussion. Today I'm going to tell you that a unit, we're going to keep this a little vague, but we're going to give you a little bit more definition than maybe what you had before. A unit, when it comes to unit testing, is something that can be reasoned about in isolation. Thought about in isolation. It's completely under your control. That means it has limited interactions with other units. Whatever a unit is, we'll get there. Could be Chicago and London have different views. It has no interactions with units outside your system. That's why it's under your control. And this one is kind of interesting. Maybe it helps you flesh out this idea that maybe a reason about isolation. It's something that only fails for one reason. That's a unit. If you can't isolate something to test that doesn't fail for only one reason, that probably should be broken out. That's multiple units, and they should be tested separately. Aren't they all mocks? I will share, since she's in the audience today, my friend Gemma, she said once upon a time here on Twitter, is it important I remember to distinguish mock stubs, fakes, and dummies? Or can I just call them all mocks and be done with it? Well, if you look at the timestamp, Martin Fowler predicted that question about 8 years previous, and he said, often as not, I see mock objects described poorly. Yes, that is another contention, that this lack of conceptual understanding, the name conflation, calling them all mocks, is part of the reason a lot of us do it wrong, and a lot of the reason part of us don't have a lot of confidence when we are doing it, and a lot of the reason that a lot of us just choose not to do it. And that's really where this talk really first came from, is in the early days I would stop and start with unit testing and test-driven development. Because what would happen, I would watch some videos and read a book, and the next thing I'm going to test drive it. And I go through the motions, and I do all the technical skills, I know how to do it, but I would often, why am I doing it this way? Which is the right way? So I'd go grab another article online or another video, and they would tell me I was doing it precisely wrong. So I'd do some more research, and after a couple of weeks of frustration not doing it at all, then I'd say, okay, I gotta do it the right way. I'll research a little more, and I'd start again. A few weeks in, I'd find another resource. And they would tell me that was doing it all wrong. And the problem was that I didn't discover until much later that there are two absolutely discrete schools of thought on test-driven development, the Chicago and London schools, and that's what we'll talk about at the end. They view the value in the process of test-driven development completely differently. The trouble is, most of the tertiary sources that we're busy with, that we see online, these videos, talks like this one, etc., they don't say, hey, I'm a proponent of this school of thought. They talk in very broad, general terms, and they assume that theirs is the one true way. And if you don't know where to kind of place that in a conceptual framework, hence the title of the talk, you don't have a conceptual map for it, it gets really confusing, and it gets really frustrating. And you spend a lot more time as a novice tester than you need to. And one of the things I think is a problem is that we don't use the language appropriately. They're not mocks, they're test doubles. Like a stunt double, a test double essentially stands in for the real actor being our system under test, which you'll often see shorthand SUT. What we're talking about, those stand-ins, we're standing in not for the star, not for the system under test, we're standing in for the collaborators. I mentioned that conflation of terms. The terms did tend to, there was conflation in the papers, in the white papers years ago. But the terms did tend to stabilize about 15 years ago. Publication of a book by Gerard Mazaros, still available, actually in test patterns. If you haven't taught me, this is a perfect book. It's a pattern catalog of PHP unit style test patterns. It is dense and thick and heavy. A lot of awesome stuff in there, but the biggest thing he did for us was he standardized the terms. It would be awesome if we all worked with the terms, were explicit, and we're talking generally said test double and not mock, and we were aware and well versed that there are several kinds of mocks: dummies, stubs, fakes, spies, and then one called actually mocks. I'm not going to go through right now what each of them are. And this is the part where we're going to click fast. You see there's some code. I would be happy, I will be here tomorrow as well, at the hotel anyway. I would be happy to talk and go through with this part with you, code level, with anybody that has the time to do it. I'm leaving it in here because I think there's some value, and when you download the slides, you'll be able to go through it yourself. But there's better stuff in terms of conceptual understanding at the end, and that's my whole contention with the talk, is that you need that conceptual understanding to be using the code effectively. So if we have to leave something out, we'll leave the code out and give you that foundation so that you can go forth and investigate further on your own. We're almost done clicking, so I'm just going to say la 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 la. I didn't realize just how many clicks this was. Pro tip, don't make every bullet a click. Or get a clicker that has like the whole let's just repeat. Mock, the last one. Yay. So where does geography come in? What do I mean London and Chicago? So London and Chicago are really just shorthand for the two schools of thought of test-driven development. Classicist, you will see often used, the classicist school of thought and the Mockist school of thought. The Chicago or classicist school of thought, it's called that because the father of test-driven development, Kent Beck, he was in Detroit and Chicago. Occasionally, you'll see we call it Detroit as well. When this book came out, Test-Driven Development by Example, very, very accessible. Go, if you haven't read this, go buy this. 25 bucks Amazon. Spend your time with it. It's one of the, if you're looking to level up in testing, I'll tell you there's a second book here in a little bit I'll tell you to buy as well. There's little you can do that's more valuable in terms of expanding your conceptual understanding. The blogs, the videos, the talks like this one, that's not where it's at in this particular area of thought. You gotta go back to the primary sources and you'll level up fast. Interestingly, I call him the grandfather of test-driven development. He actually, in the forward there, says that he's looking desperately for this book that he has lost that was at that time some 25 years old that talked about using punch cards and making the punch card that was the result by hand and then feeding through the program and comparing the two against the light to see that they worked. So they have been using some level of test-driven development according to that book already for now 40 years. But he's lost the book and he doesn't remember the title, and in the introduction he says it's one of the biggest losses of his life is not remember where that book was. So he's credited actually as being the father of test-driven development, but he was already 20 years old when that book came out. The Chicago Classicist School of Thought has a number of defining characteristics. They use test doubles only for inconvenient collaborators, meaning that if you've got a collaborator that is yours, a authentication service uses a password hasher, and those are both yours, that's all your code. The classicist school of thought would not, if you're testing the authentication service, they would not double out the password hasher. They use them together. We're going to find later that London sees that as almost an integration test. They would test that in isolation. So what is inconvenient? A third-party collaborator, certainly inconvenient. That web service might be down if you don't own it. Its API might change. What about a database? You own that. That's slow. So those are inconvenient things. The classicists will double out inconvenient collaborators, but they see, with that question, what's a unit? They see that authentication service and that password hasher as a unit, something that can be reasoned about singularly. London did disagree. Their primary concern with testing state, not behavior, not the collaboration, not the communication. So they are going to make assertions rather than expectations. They are going to say, hey, look, authentication service, I'm going to give you this. I want that back. They're actually going to do that, and then they're going to say, does this equal assertion true that this equals that? That's their classic test. They are very busy with state, not with behavior. Therefore, they make limited use of mocks and spies. You go back, you look at the section where we skip through mocks and spies, primarily concerned with behavior, dummies, fakes, stubs, primarily concerned with state. No upfront design required. Therefore, one of the strengths is it avoids over-engineering. It has a very algorithmic approach. You make no jumps. It's exploratory in nature. It's perfect for when you know the outputs. The outputs are known. And it's only the implementation that's open. So you're not bringing into it any preconceived notion about what that implementation should look like. You are exploring via the test and the code. You end up with, in the red-green refactor cycle, when you get to the refactor cycle, a lot of times with the dot class, you got way too much going on. But you didn't over-engineer it because you had no preconceived notions, there were no assumptions. Everything came from the feedback of the test engine, everything came from the code itself. What that means, though, is in the refactoring phase, and refactoring, here's another word that's misused. You hear the average conference talk, and it's about refactoring, and they're going to tell you, yes, here's how we take this legacy pile of stinking crap and we make it testable. That's not where refactoring comes from. Refactoring talks about, it comes from test-driven development, the red, failing test, green, write some good code that makes the test pass, refactor phase. It's that phase that often gets skipped in the test-driven development cycle. Here, they use it, the classicists will use it to decompose. They will, that means that they will often find themselves with this God class, with this class that does too much in the green phase, and they will decompose it. They will break it down there. No preconceived notions what they needed in terms of interfaces or what they needed in terms of an API. They all have fleshed out in the red and green phase, then it gets broken down, it gets decomposed in the refactoring phase, and that means that's where the design actually happens for the classicist, is in that refactoring phase. And I point out, I said I had kind of a little change of heart about is test-driven development, does it ensure good design? And once upon a time I said it did, and then I said, no, it's just the best tool that I know of to help you create well-designed software. And that's kind of the case. This is where that comes out. During refactoring, it's not automatic. You have to recognize the patterns that are evident in your code. You have to have those design sensitivities. It doesn't do it for you. But that cadence of, and that rhythm of red, green, refactor, and prompting you every single time that you add tests to your system, or as a result, add classes to your system, you break it down if it needs to be broken down. That's where the positive design comes in, and that's why I maintain it's the best system to help you utilize the design skills that you have more effectively. Finally, it's simple and it's simple and very easy to understand. For the novice tester, the classicist approach tends to be the one that is most effective for them to begin testing, and I think that's for a number of reasons. It's these reasons. Doubling only inconvenient collaborators, you end up doubling a lot less, so your tests are smaller and simpler. They're primarily concerned with state. Simpler to write a state-based test than a behavior-based test. Simpler to relate to, does 5 equal 5? Then did this talk to that, talk to that? No upfront design. They don't have to be able to visualize what this code is going to look like and what the relationship between the collaborators are going to be. They can program it very, very algorithmically, glom it all up into a single class, and then break it down. Novices tend to have better refactoring and decomposition skills than they do visualization skills of well-designed collaborative software. So that's primarily why I think that it's simple to understand and the best starting point for your novice. That said, it has limitations. It's got a large refactoring phase. That red-green recycle, one of the best parts about TDD is that cadence, that it goes fast. Little pieces and you're moving. And in fact, there's an interesting article that I read recently that suggests, studies were done, everybody thinks that test-driven development is automatically slower and forget that you have to learn how to do it. But even once you learn how to do it, they think that it's an investment. I'm doing more work. But I get it paid back months later when I don't have bugs. And so overall, there's a gain in terms of the pace of developing software. This paper actually posited that for the experienced tester utilizing test-driven development, the process of creating the code the first time, even if you factor out maintenance, is faster in the workplace. Why? Because that cadence of red-green refactor engenders a flow state, a high concentration, high performance state more easily. You end up focusing more, focusing better, focusing longer, producing higher quality code at a faster pace in a workplace environment, utilizing test-driven development than you would without it. They actually made an interesting aside. That flow state had many, or the red-green refactor cycle had many of the same characteristics of compulsive gambling, and the logic behind why purchased credit in-game purchases for like your Facebook game, you got to pay $2 to get extra coins and what have you, and you lose all sense of thought and value, and you just keep clicking it at the end of the month to get your cell phone bill. It's like I spent $400 on Farm Bill. There's that same psychology and engendering that flow state, and that they identify actually 5 things that engender the flow state, and test-driven development, interestingly, when done well, had all 5. Interesting. Yeah?
Is there a reference to that paper in your slides?
I will add it if I didn't already add it. Absolutely. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Oh, so that was all digression, which you don't have to do that. It means there's a large refactoring phase. Your decomposition on your design happens in the refactor, not the red-green. And so you're decomposing these God classes, and you decompose it this way, no, abstraction, you decompose it that way, it breaks that cadence, it breaks that flow state. It's a little more disjointed, a little more stop and start than you'll find in London is. It over promotes mutable state. Since they are the testing tool, the golden hammer that makes everything look like a nail, are state-based tests, assertions. So you tend to design based on mutable state. I maintain, maybe controversial, is probably the biggest problem in software design, is too much of a reliance on mutable state rather than immutable objects. Another conversation, another conference topic, we can chat about. Potential for brittle tests when classes emerge, meaning that if we're writing tests, we're building out this class in the red and green phases, and it becomes this God class. It's doing way too much, and we're going to break it down, and that's where we're going to introduce our design. 4 patterns of simple design, or solid, that's going to tell, whatever. We're going to do that all in the refactoring phase. So we've got an association between that code and those tests in red and green. Then we're going to break that apart. That single classes will become 4 classes that are collaborating. But we didn't introduce any interfaces, We did not go back and recreate any additional tests. We just broke apart a one-to-one relationship now into a number of collaborators all relying on those same tests and those same concrete implementations. That means later on, when the system changes and you do need to refactor because of changing business rules, your tests you'll find are often brittle, and you end up rewriting a lot more tests because they were specific to concrete implementations. They were too coupled to the actual classes. That happens when the classes emerge during the refactoring phase. They weren't anticipated, so they weren't accommodated in the red and green phase. Also, has a potential anti-pattern. Potential anti-pattern a lot of people run into is red, green, red, green, red, green. Oh my God. They skip the refactoring phase. It's very algorithmic, the refactoring. So that's, they wrap their head around that. Collaboration's kind of hard. I don't know exactly yet how to break this down. Let me wait till the next go-arounds to apply those good design principles. Again, it's often used by novices, so they want to get back to writing new code, not breaking down this code that already works. And so they skip the refactoring phase, and then they get 3 or 4 iterations in, 3 or 4 evolutions in, and oh, I do need to refactor. There's a heck of a lot going on here, all in the same classes that shouldn't be. Let me try to break this apart, but it's just too big. To handle conceptually, it's too big to get in your head all at the same time. Maybe that, oh my God, you have to go back to the drawing board and start over. Potential anti-pattern for classes is the approach, which we'll find with the London approach is not. It's prone to integration, friction, and system inconsistency, meaning that if we are not predicting our collaborators, we're not doing any upfront design in our head, we're not visualizing how the system will communicate, we're just very algorithmically looking at this single class. We're not really considering what the general tone of the API of the entire system is. So it could be then when we try to introduce that unit to its other units that already exist, we're going to have a little bit of friction there. Our API doesn't match up. Or if we were smart and we were keeping that in mind as we went along, we could have some system inconsistency, meaning that we use this tone in the API, we use this type of language, these types of verbs, and the rest of the system uses something different. That is endemic of the classicist approach. We'll find in a little bit that London approach answers that. It's slow and wasteful for experienced practitioners. They're writing code, writing green factor, that they know they're going to break apart in multiple classes. And if they've been there before, they know that authentication service needs that password hasher. They're not going to strip it all up into a single class. They wouldn't have to. Just to pull it apart a little bit later, they can posit, oh, hey, I need 2 classes here. And we'll see what London does to answer that up. But for the experienced practitioner, they don't have to go through that. And so it ends up being a bit slower and a bit more wasteful. The London biased approach, on the other hand, it comes out of London, out of the XP meetup, the Extreme Programming meetup in London. Steve Freeman and Matt Price are actually, I think, 5 people who wrote the original white paper, which is better than the book in many ways in terms of the foundational principles. It is noted at the end of the slides as well. Again, buy that. No joke, buy that. Best $35 you'll ever spend. So at this point, I've actually spent $60 on your career. And probably some total 12 hours reading between the 2. There is nothing in the world that you can do better to level up than get back to the original sources and do those 2 things. This is extremely accessible. Both of these books are the absolute opposite of that original patterns book that I showed you that was a cure for insomnia. These are conversational, they're accessible, they use code that makes sense to you. They start out very simply and only get more complicated as you get deeper into the book. They tell a story. You'll feel like you're learning as you go. You're not going to have to crack your skull. It's very, very accessible. But this is the canonical text for the London School or Marcus School, and it's their own fault. They call themselves the Marcus School. They should be the Dublin School. And we get that name conflation already with the genesis of the approach. But I will, true to how they claim, how they identify themselves, refer to them as Marcists, but they're not all monks. They're doubles. So, its defining characteristics. It will double, the Marcist will double any interesting collaborator. Remember, in classes at school, we would double out when we had a test. We have a system under test. We have a authentication service, and we have a password hasher. That's interesting. There's behavior over there, but it's not inconvenient. It's ours, and it's not slow. It's not subject to going down. So the classicist would say, hey, that's even. The Marcist will say, no, no, no. I can do better. I can introduce a double for the password hasher, let's say, and now I can reason about the authentication service in isolation, and that's better for me in terms of pushing design. They're going to be primarily concerned then with behavior. Communication then between those two objects is going to be what they're testing. State a little bit, we'll get to that, but they are going to, unlike the classicist, the Marcist is going to be concerned then with how these pieces fit together and are they communicating appropriately. When I ask the authentication service, to do something with my password, does the authentication service reach out to the password hasher and get it hashed, for instance? That is the better encapsulation. The Marcists, you'll find, are very, very busy with utilizing the testing, the methodology of testing to drive better object-oriented programming. Conversely, you would have a very easy time adapting classicists to functional and procedural programming. It'd be pretty hard with the Marcist approach to utilize that with other paradigms. Very, very tied to object-oriented paradigm. Since they're concerned with behavior, they make extensive use of models and spies. Okay? Hence Marcists. It's a very systematic approach. What does systematic mean? I couldn't come up with a better word. They're kind of a global conceptual approach. They are keeping in mind the potential collaborators and the system as a whole as they're designing and testing this unit. They're thinking, where does this unit fit in the big picture a lot more than the classicist is. And therefore, it doesn't have that friction or that system inconsistency. Maybe that is a bullet point I got down here, so I put it in the wrong place. It's more hypothetical in nature. It's not exploratory. What does that mean? It means I'm not building off the code that I have right now and adding one more little bit, one more little bit, one more little bit. That is exploratory. It is that I posit, okay, I need a little more. And so I need a way to create a user, okay, fine. And the authentication service, it's going to need a password hasher. I kind of figure all that out in red and green before I write my first test. I hypothesize that I'm going to need a couple of these collaborators, and then I test my theory with red green refactor. Sometimes I'm wrong. I'll fix it up in refactor, but I posit the existence of those collaborators at the beginning, and that's what I mean that it's very hypothetical in nature. For the inexperienced practitioner, that's fine for something, the type of task that they've been tasked with many times before. I know how the controller works with an application service, do it in my sleep, so I know how to test this, so fine, they might fall back to this. For more interesting, novel behaviors, this is really, really hard for the less experienced practitioner, not only a TDD, but the less experienced software designer. You kind of have to have a vision and be able to visualize how these pieces communicate. And as I became more of a Marcist myself and less of a classicist, that's where my feel about test-driven development changed. And yeah, it was not itself the thing that guaranteed high-quality software. It just was a workflow that let me do the better thing more easily. But it was still me. I had to double down on my design choice. So in the refactoring stage, they use it differently. They're not decomposing, they're composing. The design happens during the red and green phases. They're predicting what they need. They write the test for that. They isolate all of the collaborators. They predicted the need for those as well. So they're creating a lot of interfaces and doubles during during the green phase. And then they realize when they get to refactor, not that they've got a guide class that does too much, but they've over-abstracted. They don't need all of those interfaces. They predicted that they might come to swap this out, or these might be separate behaviors, and the abstraction, it became apparent that the abstraction was a bit thin, and that those are really part and parcel of the same behavior, and they can be a single class. So rather than decomposing, they compose. But that's not a design thing. That is a traditional refactor. I've got a smell here, I need to fix it. Whereas in the classicist approach, you're making design decisions there. You're deciding what should collaborate with what and which responsibilities go where. So the design by them, by the Machists, happens during red and green. So that's that idea that it's more hypothetical. You have to posit that design early. You need to bring more design chops to the table. Why it's a little bit more difficult for me to understand. They test outside in. It lends itself to behavioral development. You find that BDD actually historically, Dan brought it out of the XP user group that had created the London approach to test-driven development. He maintains it's essentially test-driven development taken to the nth degree. You're able to test from the outside in. What does that mean? We use a layered web app. We're often looking at that kind of stuff. You can have I need behavior, I need to go log in. You know that's going to get some kind of authentication controller, let's say. You can start the controller, and I don't have to have that there was an authentication service that existed already to be able to test that controller. Why? Because I know I'm going to need it. So I posit that, I lay out the interface for it, and I double it out in my test. So now I can work with the test level. The authentication service need not even exist. I can finish all my tests for that single unit, for that controller, let's say. When I'm done with that, my acceptance test still doesn't pass, as it doesn't work yet. It's not all there, part of the system's missing. But I was able to reason about that controller in isolation. And now I'll take another loop in TDD, and I will deal with the next unit, that authentication service. Well, that authentication service, it needs the password hasher, let's say. So I posited that was needed. I hypothesized this, so I created an interface. I wrote a test for it, I created an interface, and I doubled it out. And now I'm able to reason just about the authentication service. Once that's done, acceptance test didn't fail. But I get another loop in TDD. Now I'll deal with the password hasher. Finally, when I finish that, the outside loop, the BDD loop, the acceptance test loop, it's going to pass. So I was able to go literally from the outside of the system to the inside. That's really, really good for feature-based development. Product tells you it needs to do this. I don't have to start down in the kishkas of the system, the things that are already built, and work outward. I can start with the behaviors and work inward. You'll find because the classicist is exploratory, they're dealing with code they already have, they're going to work from the domain layer out to the controller, for instance, in a typical layered web application. A bit different approach, less feature-driven, and it seems to be, my limited experience I found to be true, it seems to be historically that with the London approach, you're that much more likely to be spot on to deliver that feature with what product really wanted than if you're starting from the inside of your system and building it out and trying to get it there. And finally, I did say this previously, because we're very systematic, there is a little integration friction. We're keeping in mind from the very beginning these relationships between collaborators and messaging patterns, so we end up with very, very high system consistency as well. We typically have a tighter API language throughout the system. But it has its limitations. Oh, the last one, I'm sorry. Focus on collaboration promotes better object-oriented programming. We're busy with the messaging. If you're familiar with that famous Alan Keyes quote, what is object-oriented programming? It's message passing. This is the approach that gets you to the heart of that understanding of object-oriented programming. We're really most concerned with communication and collaboration between classes. And that's the same thing. Very, very connected to object-oriented programming and best practices. Would not be applicable in a procedural or artificial paradigm. But it has its limitations. Potential for over-engineering. Yeah, I think I need that. Let me give an interface. I think I need that. Let me put another interface. So my very first test has like 17 different test levels. So I posited out all these interfaces. And then in the refactoring phase, I don't collapse enough of them. And I've over-engineered this thing. I've got a simple thing. So 2 classes, it's got 12, 7 interfaces. Build these structures. Yeah, and that's something you better at over time. You recognize the patterns, you recognize the tendency, but it does lend itself to encouraging over-engineering. Second, limited feedback from code requires visualization. You're not building from existing code and getting the feedback from that, and then it's not the exploratory. It is, I need to visualize up front what I need and what the relationships are before I start to code. So you need to bring more design chops to the table. It's less suitable than for exploratory work. It's typically driven by features, lends itself to, hey, I need this thing done, and working from there, not fleshing out algorithms or something like that. It's not really the appropriate approach again. Potential for mock overload, that's, I guess, related to over engineering, that you've got to quote again David Meyer Hansen, you've got mocks returning mocks. That's an anti-pattern. That shouldn't be. You should change your code. You should change your implementation. That should never happen. But there is that potential, and then it becomes painful and a mess 6 iterations later. Your tests become very, very hard to write if you don't factor that out. Behavioral tests, traditionally more difficult to compose than state-based tests. Again, when you reason about messaging, it's a little more difficult. Reason about collaboration, less effective than the reason about state. Very, very easy to say 2 + 2 and I should get back 4. Is that true? 4 equals the answer? Perfect. That's very easy to understand and conceptualize and write tests for. The tests that focus on behavior and message passing and collaboration, they tend to be a little bit more complicated, a little bit more conceptually difficult. Requires solid design skills coming in. If your recognition of code spells is not strong, if you're solid, it's not strong. If your telephone ask is not strong. If your four rules of simple design is not strong. Mockist TDD is not going to help you a lot there. Classicist, I think, does. But Mockist is not going to help you there if you don't bring in the solid software design skills. You kind of have a little bit been there, done that. Therefore, it's difficult for novice practitioners. So the question, which of those should we use? 2 completely different schools of thought. They approach the question of test-driven development and really software design from 2 opposite ends. And the answer there is that use a both. Use a both. In terms of your career as a tester, I think you will find that unless the classicist approach really speaks to you and fits the way you think, Kent Beck, for instance, you will start as a classicist and you will eventually evolve to more of a mockist. That seems to be the pattern. But there is no, it's not an either or choice. There are systems which are appropriate to test as a classicist. They're exploratory, they're algorithmic. I'm not going to use, there isn't that much collaboration there. I'm trying to flesh out an algorithm. I'm worried about state. I'm going to use a classic approach. But if we're in a highly collaborative system, then obviously, even if I think better as a classicist, I would be more well suited, or the problem is more well suited to using mockist approaches. Which do I use? I do tend toward a more mockist approach, and maybe even use it sometimes when it would have been easy enough to use a state-based approach. That was a conscientious decision when I moved to more immutable structures. It was also how I think about entrepreneurial programming. The design skills that I grew within myself. I think about collaboration a lot more than I used to. I think about state a lot less. So it seems to fit, but nobody uses just one or the other. Classicist, hardcore classicist, Kent Beck will use mocks as necessary, and any collaborator, for instance, and Matt Price, a hardcore Londonist, they will use state-based tests for anything that's algorithmic. So the fun ending for Q&A is from David Meyer Hansen, the BDFL of the Ruby on Rails community, asked provocatively, as he is known to do, last summer, is TDD dead? And the implication was, yes, TDD is dead. And it got a lot of attention. That's usually why I talk. And, it led to an interesting set of videos. He and Martin Fowler and Kent Beck got together. And they basically came out that, yeah, classicist is good and mockist is bad, and no, TDD is not dead. That was a little bit of an dramatic question. It was unfair, though, because they didn't invite a mockist to the party. Had they invited Matt Price to that party, the conversation would have been different. Martin Fowler, classicist, Kent Beck, the father of the classic approach. So, of course, they were going to all agree. It turned into a bit of a backslapping contest, and it was disappointing in the end. But they covered a lot of good stuff. There are 3 videos that are worth watching. But the underlying assumption when he asked the question of TDD TDD is dead, it's taken seriously, is that to mock or not to mock, that is the question. That is how he understood that question to be. Should we mock or should we not mock? It was either or. He talked about mocks returning mocks, and all this pain and suffering that was because of test-driven development. And I maintain that that's a false dichotomy. Classicists, mock occasion. Trivia question. It's a bunch of fact, I guess. The one place where you have to use a test double, a hardcore classicist, you have to use a test double or you will not be able to test your system. Caching. Because you can't tell if you can cache or not. They're the same. Have to use a double there. And of course, mockists aren't going to mock exclusively. Something very, very algorithmic and exploratory, they're not going to mock. So it's a false dichotomy. They're both tools in the toolbox. You should be comfortable using both. He talked about the famous line that he used was testing-induced design damage. Mocks returning mocks, and it was just pain and suffering. And when he stopped doing all that, he again equated test-driven development with the mockist camp. He abandoned test-driven development. He just moved to classicist camp. His life became magically better. He didn't have all those problems. So what I'm going to tell you is, when he was saying testing-induced design damage, what he was really saying was that he had design-induced testing damage. Yeah, because your tests are supposed to drive your design, not the other way around. Your design doesn't drive your tests. You're not doing them after, you're doing them before. And if there's friction, if you've got mocks, returning mocks, what are you supposed to do? Not complain on the internet. You're supposed to change your darn design so that you don't have to do that in order to test it. So he had the test friction that TDD is supposed to give him. It was saying, change your darn design. The only thing is, if you're the BDFL of a framework that's traditionally difficult to test, you can't change your design. So you have to throw TDD out the window. So the answer to, is TDD dead? TDD, at least in our community, is, I maintain, on the level. Yeah, we conflate terms. We don't know, many of us, that we start trying to test. We don't know that there's different schools of thought. And when I read this article, it's talking about that school of thought, and this other article is talking about some other school of thought. They don't fit together, they seem contradictory. I don't know where to hang them on a conceptual map, because I don't even know those two schools exist. I deal in the tertiary sources, I've never seen the primary sources. I was unaware of just how accessible they actually are. We can flame terms, we call them mocks, even when they're test doubles. Yeah, we just don't communicate about it well. We don't communicate that its primary advantage is its impact on design. We talk about that it's so we can go home at night and not have to worry that we're going to get a 12 a.m. phone call that something's down in production because there was an error that we could have tested before and didn't. It's not about confidence and ability to refactor, regression proofing. It's about design. We don't message it well in our community. We don't teach it well in our community. So it's unlevel. But to my last little shtuck at the DHH, it will outlast those who are questioning its viability. So the prescriptions, focus on the benefit, software design. Those of us who are practitioners of TDD, and when we talk about it with novices, the juniors on our team, that's how you need to message it. If you want them to embrace it, and you want them to study in such a way that they level up with it quickly and don't have that unnecessary pain and suffering. We need, as a community, a great theoretical conceptual education. I didn't educate much. I basically went 90 miles an hour and told you where all the problems were. I gave you really just the high-level stuff. But remember, form mattered, dumbing down the expectations. If I gave you food for thought, yeah, mission accomplished. So, but you need to go out and you need to study. Start with those two books. But as we message it, as we level up, and we're teaching others, know that they're probably lacking as well in that theoretical and conceptual. We need more talks that are busy with that. We need more blog posts that are busy with that. Not how to configure a PHP unit or how to test a certain, how to test an OAuth. Books, I'll give you some what they call it, references again. These are the three that I mentioned. They're all available on Amazon. They're all current. The first one is really throw stuff. But the second two, seriously, they'll buy them. If you buy them, if you read them, if you make a good faith effort in leveling up your testing after having read those two, and you're still feeling the same pain about TDD that you did before, on CodeRabbi, you'll find me. I'll buy those for you. Papers, mock rules, not objects. That's Ruben Price from the London School. So their friends McKinnon and Mullins. Start with that. That's free. See how accessible the actual white paper is on London testing. pretty accessible. And if you need a little bit more convincing, start with that and then jump to my books. A couple blogs. These are going to help you understand the skip part. I'll check my time here. Maybe we'll go back and catch, but I don't think so. No. So the part about what does a mock look like, what does a stub look like, what does a spy look like, etc. They're in these slides. Code samples as well. More bulleted points that explain it. You should be able to get it just from the slide, but this is some good background on it. We'll talk about R.C. Martin and Martin Father. First one's a blog post. No, they're both blog posts. No white papers. Really, really accessible and conversational. And that was from London, or from Chicago to London. Questions?
Can you go back to those words, please?
I'm sorry?
I'll
join in. Yeah. Forgive me, I might not make them available on join until tomorrow night. I'm going to stick around the conference here a little bit, and then whatever Jewish Sabbath comes in at 5, I might not get it done right now, because I want to add the reference for Gemma that I forgot about compulsing gambling and farm bill and test-driven development. But for certain, by tomorrow night, before I fly out of here, we'll get those up on joined in and be able to come up.
So are you Chicago or London?
I am 85% London. Simple stuff, I'll use more state-based classic approaches, but I deal with highly collaborative systems, and that's kind of how I think about things, so I'm very London.
What about Grumpy Programmer?
Strikes me, I've never had a conversation, strikes me from the way that he messages it, and I always, and I didn't previously, and I'll apologize to him now, I always offer an apology when I give this talk, because he's one of the primary messengers in our community about the value of testing and the value of test-driven development. And we would not be, as a PHP community, where we are today without his efforts. I mean, we all ought to stand up when he comes in the room. At the same time, his Genesis story, his creation mythology, which he'll share with you, is, he was in crunch time and he was tired of being asked to stay late from work because things weren't working. He was tired of getting called, pagers, what have you, on the weekends. That's great. That's what brought him to the table and to study test-driven development. But if you stop there in the messaging, people assume that that's its greatest value. Well, heck, if I test after, I also have that value. And so there's a little disservice there. He does seem to be a classicist, so maybe I kind of get that. I don't know if he is exactly. We've never paired program. But from what I see him tweeting about and what I see him publishing, it seems he's a little bit classicist. And I guess of the two schools, they are a little bit more about its regression proofing, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, like I said, you have to stand up when the guy comes in the room. He's done a tremendous service to the community in terms of testing. The messaging could be a little better, I think, for taking us to the next step. Yeah. Okay.
Would you just flip back to those slides with the names of the books on them?
Yeah, sure. Next question. Somebody raise your hand, shout out. I'm doing it. I don't know if we'll go. That was it? All right. I threw a lot at you really, really fast. I know. Basically, couldn't figure out in this subject area what to cut. This is like what you need to be thinking about when you start and what we're not getting. And I was the only one talking about it, so I want to give it to you all. Like I said, it goes really well. It's more a conversation than a monologue. That takes 2 hours. So I gave it all to you really high level. I'll be here for a couple hours. I'll tell all day tomorrow. I'm flying out to Sunday morning, so you can find me. Twitter, coderabbi@gmail.com. I'll talk about this all day long if you want. So yeah, if you're leaving with your head spinning, well, where do I go next? I need a little bit more before I can jump into studying the stuff I'm trying to love. I'll give it to you. You just have to ask. Thank you very much.